Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Diabetes Digital Podcast. We are thrilled to have one of our dietitian friends on this week to talk about a very controversial topic in the world of diabetes and just nutrition in general, and that is artificial sweeteners. People that have diabetes and prediabetes use artificial sweeteners very often, thinking that, they might be a healthier alternative to whether it's sugar or honey or maple syrup. And so we're going to talk about that, like safety concerns when it comes to artificial sweeteners. We're also going to talk about how much is safe to consume, if it is safe to consume artificial sweeteners. Some of the health concerns that a lot of people have raised to us when it comes to artificial sweeteners, what the research has to say. And also, we're going to talk about some alternatives like monk fruit, which is something that's really popular now. We're going to talk about how it compares to other sweeteners and more. Welcome to the Diabetes Digital Podcast. I'm Wendy.
And I'm Jess, and we're best friends, registered dietitians, and diabetes educators.
Through our telehealth platform, diabetesdigital.co, we offer accessible and personalized virtual nutrition counseling for people with diabetes and prediabetes.
Visit diabetesdigital.co, that's C-O, to book your first appointment. We accept insurance and offer affordable self-pay options. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Jess, can you tell us who we have on the podcast this week?
Yes, this week we have the lovely Maya Feller, who is a dietitian. She's based in Brooklyn, and she is the owner of Maya Feller Nutrition. Maya is known for sharing her approachable food-based solutions with millions of people through regular speaking engagements, writing, her social platforms, and is a national nutrition expert on Good Morning America. As a Healthline medical advisor, she's on the advisory board of Shape and Parents magazine. She also appears on the Today Show, Tamron Hall, and in the New York Times, and so many other publications. Maya is also the author of Eating from Our Roots, 80 plus healthy home cooked favorites from cultures around the world, which is from Goop Press. And she's a co-host of Well Now podcast, which is Slate's newest wellness podcast. That is so many accomplishments. I feel like this is the longest list and I cut out like 75%. This is the longest list from anyone who we've had on the pod. What does it feel like to be so accomplished, Maya?
Well, first, I have to say, Wendy and Jess, thank you both for having me on. And I'm honored to talk to both of you because I always have loved being a colleague of yours, and I appreciate the work that you both have done over the last decade. And so I want to make sure to give you your flowers because I think you both are incredibly accomplished. So, thank you. Of course.
You're so sweet. Well, we're thrilled to revisit conversation. I feel like it's been so long since we've spoken, and we thought that you would be the perfect person to cover this topic because I feel like you are able to dissect the research and the science in a very practical way where the everyday person can understand. And artificial sweeteners are one of those things where it's just very confusing. There's so many questions, so many concerns. So I think a good place to start would be just like, what are artificial sweeteners? Can you give us an overview of what they are and why someone might want to consume them?
Yes, absolutely. So, I have to echo what you just said, Wendy, like the level of controversy around the low and no calorie sweeteners, like you would think we're talking about war or atomic bombs.
Yeah.
And it is like, no, it is so contentious and folks are literally up in arms and there's massive amounts of confusion. I think back to last summer, and we'll talk about this later on in the pod, but oh my gosh, it is like hellfire. So to answer your question about non-nutritive sweeteners, and this is the USDA definition, and I want to read it. The reason I want to read it is so that it's very clear. It's not my interpretation, but it is the USDA, and then I'll also do FDA. So USDA, they call them actually non-nutritive sweeteners, but low and no calorie sweeteners are sugar substitutes, right? They're alternatives that have either no or very low amounts of carbohydrate. And so that's why it's low or no calorie. And then the FDA actually calls them non-caloric sweeteners. And there's a list that they have that's generally regarded as safe.
Great definitions. I'm also wondering, like, what are some of the most common types of artificial sweeteners? Maybe the FDA has a list, or just from you being a dietitian, what have you come across as the top brands?
So when we're thinking about like brand names, you're thinking stevia. That's one of the herbal ones and it's from the plant. But then there's, of course, equal. You know, I was away last weekend and there was this whole little caddy of all these sugars and sugar substitutes. And I was like, there's tab. I feel like that's still out there. But really, it's aspartame, it's saccharin, it's sucralose, there's stevia, as I said, and then there's also neomate, and then there's also asasulfame
Okay.
K. Yeah. So that is
Sounds
actually,
familiar.
yeah, I know. It's like they're all of
Yeah.
these. You might want to cut that out because yeah, it's asasulfame K. It's like, oh my gosh, asa who what now? No, but seriously, like, or leave it in, right? So, but there's really aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, neomate, stevia, and then the acetate, asasulfamine K. So, those are the common ones, and that one you probably would see listed as sweet one if
Okay.
people are looking for like a brand name. Now, when we're thinking about those common ones, they're everywhere, right? They're in grocery stores, they're at coffee shops. The difference really between them is kind of how they break down and their aftertaste, which I think is really interesting. Because when I dug a little deeper and I took a look at it, I was like, oh, that's fascinating, right? So, like, think about Sweet and Low. We all know the aftertaste that Sweet and Low has. That's saccharin. It is like not super bitter, but it's like something that you're like, I taste that, especially when you have it like in a large amount or if you're really using like 2 teaspoons. Now, if you're thinking about sucralose, that would be something like Splenda. And that also has its own unique flavor profile. If you're thinking about something like aspartame, right? You kind of know what that tastes like as well. So I feel like when we're talking about these low and no calorie sweeteners, people choose them for different reasons. And we'll get into that, I'm sure. But there's a wide variety. And I think what's important to know is that the common types have gone through testing and are therefore on the market because they were found to be safe.
I want to get into the safety of these in general and also for people with diabetes. But before getting into that, I'm just wondering, out of all the ones you have tasted, do you
Mm-hmm.
have a favorite, like, that you feel tastes the best? Because I know for me, I don't really love any of them.
Yeah,
But I'm
same.
wondering for you, is there any that I know my mom and my sister, they love stevia, Truvia, and I just can't get with the taste. But what are your thoughts?
Well, so, Jess, I have to tell you, truthfully, I am not a lover of sweets, which is interesting. I'm much more of a
Whoa.
savory eater. So if you said to me, hey, Maya, I made you a cake, or you were like, hey, girl, here's a piece of fish, I'd be like, I'll take the fish sticks. And
Hmm.
even at the end of the evening when like dinner's all wrapped up, I'm like, I'll have some nuts. Like I'm just not a huge lover of sweet things. And my taste palette experiences these low and no calorie sweeteners as extra sweet, which
Yeah.
means that I like them even less. That's just
Okay.
Mhm.
me personally. Interestingly enough, my dad loves stevia. And he's like, whenever I get samples, I like pack them up, I put them in the mail, and I send them to Florida.
Sounds like you would get along with my mom.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that these sweeteners are generally considered safe. Can we talk about some of the health concerns?
Mhm.
Because something that I see come up all the time is like the impact that they could have on your gut health or how they might impact your insulin sensitivity and things like that. What does the science have to say about that? Should people be concerned about consuming these?
Before I even get into that, I do want to give like a little nod to aspartame, and folks who have PKU really should avoid it. Like, they just shouldn't, because it has two specific amino acids, phenylalanine and then aspartic acid. And so for folks who have PKU, it's an absolute no. The other thing that I have to say is the population under the age of 2, this is also just a full no-go. So those are two populations that I want to call out 100%. Like, this is just to skip it altogether.
Okay.
When it comes to the safety concerns, I want to just like go back to last summer. So IARC, they put out a brief and they classified aspartame as a possible carcinogen to humans, and it got grouped into group 2B. And it was on the basis that there's limited evidence in humans that there might be the possibility for a type of liver cancer, right? And there was limited evidence in humans. Now, then at the same time, JECFA came out and they said that there was no sufficient reason to change any of the previous recommendations. And this created a massive kind of, I don't even know how to say it without using bad words, a massive storm, right? And people were like, wait a second, we have one agency who report on cancer risk, and then we have another agency coming out with conflicting findings.
Right.
Prior to this, there was this acceptable daily intake level, and it was 0 to 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight for aspartame. And like I said, JACFA was like, listen, there's no reason to change this. It's interesting because what we saw as dietitians in our world of nutritionists was all of these influencers, many of them are friends, going on social media and standing up for aspartame. And then they got blasted, like quite literally blasted. Letters were sent out, and then there was a whole, what was it, Washington Post thing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
Dietitians are out there pushing all this artificial stuff on people. And it became this really contentious argument. When we're talking about safety, really USDA, FDA, they all say that these, I believe it's 90 that they have like this whole list of, they're all generally regarded as safe. Now, to your question, Wendy, like when I dug through some of the science, because I wanted to revisit it for our conversation, and there are studies that do say things like, inconsistent finding. However, these are meta-analyses. So they're looking at bodies of research. And they're looking at bodies of research and then they're saying, well, they're inconsistent finding. It's not like they're running an entire new study. They're taking a bunch of studies and they're analyzing them and looking at them. And when they look at all of them together, some of the researchers are finding inconsistency. And they're saying like, okay, there's a question of elevated insulin levels. And however, there needs to be more longer term randomized controlled trials, which is like the gold standard for research. And there was a study that we found where people who consumed low and no calorie sweeteners had higher levels of insulin resistance, which is obviously not what we want in the case of someone who has diabetes or prediabetes. There were some studies that found that there may be changes in the gut microbiome, but then I also have to say anything we eat changes our gut microbiome. So I want to take that with a grain of salt. But then I also have to acknowledge that, the truth is, it is a great alternative for people who are looking for a low or no calorie alternative to table sugar, and for people who are thinking about a tool that can help them, when they want to have something sweet. But I also have to acknowledge that, yeah, for sure, we always need more research, and we always need more research in a variety of populations. And we need studies over time where people are having different eating patterns and including these things. So what do I say to people? It's be an informed consumer, make a choice that works for you. And, the research says that it is safe. And there are some conflicting studies that give pause, but the research overwhelmingly says that it is a safe alternative.
Okay. I appreciate the nuance and kind of going into it's safe and also here's some red flags. Just to back up a little bit, you mentioned two organizations. I think you said IARC and JACFA. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about like what those organizations do just so people have a little bit of context to like what their recommendation might stand for or who it represents? I think you said IARC is an organization that's focused on cancer research.
Cancer. Okay, so IARC is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And the reason that that was so confusing is because they really do this research on cancer. And so what they found was that it was a possible carcinogen. And as I said, they grouped it into like a 2B carcinogen. And there was limited evidence. They said this really clearly when they put out their findings from the public perspective, right? Hearing that agency that's focused on cancer research comes out, even with limited findings, can be scary. Now, there's a joint committee on food additives with the WHO, the World Health Organization, and that's JECFA, right? So they are the ones that many people say should really actually be putting out these findings because they're the people that do the research on food additives. And so it gets confusing because then the question is, well, whose domain is this? And the
Right.
truth is, like, when we're talking to the public doesn't have the possibility to like say, okay, I'm going to pick up X study and I'm going to do a deep dive into this study and understand the nuance. And I'm going to just roll back for a second and say, this was an unfortunate outcome because there's already a loss of trust, especially around guidelines and recommendations, especially in the light of the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So folks are
Mhm.
already like, well, are you telling us the truth? And do you have
Yeah.
our best interests in mind?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that, like, from a socio-emotional perspective, there are multiple layers at play. From a scientific perspective, it is very confusing to have two agencies come out with two large agencies, right, come out with conflicting information, and then to have the people who, like us, right, we're supposed to be the professionals, speak the truth of the research and then get blasted by the media. So it's like whammy, 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 whammy all over the place.
And when it comes to people that have diabetes, because you mentioned about the research that's been done and its impact on blood sugar levels and things like that, what does the research have to say? Like, how do these artificial sweeteners impact blood sugar levels or insulin levels?
What the research that I saw was that it can be a great alternative, right? The key, and I think the understanding specifically from the World Health Organization, and I want to be really clear in my saying this, and the reason that I'm saying it is because sometimes people confound, conflate, and mix the two. We're talking about blood sugars, we're not talking about weight. People hear low and no calorie and they think weight loss, reduction in blood sugars. That's not what we're saying. Also, WHO says this is not a weight loss tool. So I want to be really clear in this conversation that this is not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is using this low or no calorie alternative in place of table sugar as a management tool to help keep blood sugars level or to help reduce spikes in blood sugars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How do artificial sweeteners compare to natural sweeteners like honey and maple syrup? Because a lot of times people will say, like, oh, well, I'm having honey or agave, and therefore it's better than sugar. And so I'm just curious, like, what do you tell your patients when they're comparing artificial sweeteners to things like honey, syrup, and agave?
So what I say is like honey, syrup, and agave, they're still sugars, like the way that the body perceives them and how they get absorbed into the bloodstream. I mean, you both know this, and that I'm sure you counsel the same way, right? So it's like there's this health halo that happens, and we do all this like crazy greenwashing where we're like, oh, I'm so virtuous, I had agave, or I'm really good, I didn't have white table sugar, I had the alternative. And it is an alternative. It is a different option. They do have different nutrient profiles, like depending on where you get your maple syrup. And if it's all artisan and like, that it might have some more vitamins and minerals. And it's still 15 grams of carbohydrate in that tablespoon. You know what I mean? It's sugar, the way that the body perceives it. So what I say to people is, if you have a reason to not have them, and for example, some of my patients, like GI folks who have reactions to certain types of sugars, cannot tolerate the wide variety that there is. That's a reason to modify. If you want to modify based on taste, that's how you modify. If you want to modify based on affordability and what you have access to in your area, modify. But saying that you're having maple syrup over white table sugar doesn't actually mean that you are inherently better or that you are making a better choice. You're already good as you are. So let's just be clear about that. But one is not better than the other. They all have their uses.
Yeah. My favorite is when people say, well, it's brown sugar. Like, I don't know where this comes from. But they're like, well, it's brown sugar. It's better than white sugar. I'm like, it's really the same thing.
It's just that, like you said, it affects your body the same.
Yeah.
It does. And the thing for me, like the more time I spend in this space, the more I realize that there's so much conflicting information and so much confusion around the act of eating and metabolic health that people add a virtue to it.
Yeah.
And it's like at the root of this, right? What we're talking about is someone who's trying to focus on their blood sugars, having options that actually support their health outcomes.
Yeah.
And yet, when we give folks options, then people are damning them for actually using the options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm like,
absolutely.
Right? You're just like, wait a second. So now we're blaming people for taking advantage of what has been created as a support system.
Yeah. Say it louder for the people in the back.
I mean, I was about to go somewhere else, but then I was like, you know what? Let's stay on track. Let's stay on track.
But I think I'm just glad you said it because, again, the moral virtue with the choices, I think at the end of the day, we have options and that's a beautiful thing. And of course, like access is also, like you mentioned, a consideration. And so maybe some people do have less options and we need to support whatever people pick as the best option given their circumstance, their preferences, all of those things.
Right. I agree. And the other thing too, Jess, I have to give a plug to is, as I said before, I think it's really important in this conversation to be super clear that we are not centering weight or dieting.
Yeah.
Like I said it, but like I want to say it again, because oftentimes, especially with these options, the low and no calorie sweeteners, people put that into the diet food category. And then especially when we're talking about things like reducing blood sugars, people think dieting. And I want to be clear, we're talking about modifying a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and other metabolic dysfunction. This is what the conversation is, right? So we're talking about how can we use tools that are available to us and our patients for actually improving our health outcomes. That's the conversation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Something that comes up a lot for people that have diabetes is, should I have less of the sugary drinks or should I do the diet alternative and have more, especially for people that have uncontrolled diabetes? Because I think the diet drinks and the non-nutritive sweeteners, they can be very helpful for someone who has an A1C, I don't know, of like 10%, where they, are really trying to be mindful of how much added sugar they're taking in. And then it's like, well, should I maybe just have 4 ounces of juice, or should I go with like the 20-ounce diet drink. What are your thoughts on that? Is there room for both? Is it just like whatever you prefer to do, or what would you recommend?
So that's interesting. So this is where I say really we're going to personalize. But if I were to give like a general, I would say this for the person that wants to have the regular soda and they're like, no, I'm having the regular soda and there's not a conversation. Then I start to say, well, how much can we modify the quantity that you're having? Right. And can we back it up to a meal? Right. So I'm like, can we modify the quantity and can we back it up to a meal? Because it's a liquid carbohydrate. And I'm thinking about like, as dietitians and clinicians, our job is to take care of our patients. Right. And so I'm the steward of the insides. And I'm like, oh boy, how can I help your insides? And so I'm like, could you back it up to a meal? If you can, then I'm like, that's fantastic. And if you can modify the quantity, it's less of a dump going in. So that's one conversation that I'll have. And then for folks who are like, oh, I love my diet soda or I love my zero sodas. And I'm like, okay, that's also fine. My question is, how do you feel after you've had it? Is it satisfying? Does it elicit the desire for something else sweet? Is it displacing your intake of water or other sparkling things or tea that is hydrating? Is it actually blunting your appetite? And especially for folks who are working on having level blood sugars, I actually want you to eat. I mean, I want everyone to eat, let's be clear, but I definitely want you to not meal skip. And so if it's displacing your desire or blunting your appetite for food, then it's a conversation that I want to have. And the truth is, if I'm thinking about people's gut microbiome, I want to look at it in the context of your whole pattern of eating, right? Like, what are you having with it? And like, what are you rounding out that eating pattern with? The truth is, like, I don't actually have issue with like most foods. The things that I don't want people to eat are like spoiled foods, things that they're, allergic to, things that are toxic. Like that's where I'm like, I start to be like, hey, slow down. But I think it's all a conversation because at the end of the day, we know people engage in behaviors that they can replicate. And if they can't replicate the behavior, they're not going to do it.
Yeah. Great advice. I couldn't stop thinking, girl, you look good when you back that carb up. I'm like, is that a new slogan?
What does it mean though? Like to like back it up. You were saying like back it up with a meal. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what that means.
Oh, so yeah.
Can you explain what you mean?
I want to stand up and just like back it up. I
know, me
too. So what I mean is do your best. Try not to have that like regular soda as a standalone. So
okay, with a meal.
Exactly. So like I like folks I'm a huge like visual person. I say the craziest things to my patients in session. And they're always like, oh, but that's stuck. And I'm like, yeah. So, it's like folks have heard this on this pod before, but when you have that liquid carbohydrate, it's just a rush in, right? But when the liquid carbohydrate is consumed with a meal, it enters slower. Right. And also there's some question about whether or not it's before, in middle or after, how far after. But my desire for anybody is to have the slowest absorption possible for that individual of whatever carbohydrates are headed into their bloodstream.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on monk fruit? And because I'm seeing that is, an ingredient, a sweetener that's in a lot of things. I think it's even in my protein powder. And how does that compare to the other types of sweeteners?
So it's really funny. I was like, should I tell the truth? Should I be like honest about so there's the me and then there's like what I say to people. First I'll give you like the nice answer, right? So monk fruit is actually it's a plant. And it's also, like you said, it's one of the no calorie sweeteners. What the research says in terms of blood sugars is that in general, there's minimal impact. So meaning that people are not going to get a blood sugar spike. It's not as refined as stevia, quote unquote. For me, the biggest con, and I'm closing my eyes as I say
Uh-oh.
this, is the unpleasant aftertaste. It's super strong. I can't tolerate it. Remember, I don't like this class of options for myself.
Yeah.
However, for some people, they don't mind it. I can taste it when I have a protein powder that has monk fruit in it. I'm like, oof. I'm like, give me the
Yeah.
original unsweetened, please. And then I'm going to do whatever I want to do to it. In comparison or relation to stevia, for example, is FDA has not approved the entire leaf of stevia as a food additive, only specific refined products. And monk fruit, as I said, is not as refined as stevia. So that's one thing. It can be substituted in the same way for sugar. And it's pretty stable when baking. When it's in liquid form, it mixes well. The key is going to be getting the ratio correct. And I remember once baking, it was like, oh my gosh, it was after you all did your first cookbook. And I was working on my Southern Comfort Food Diabetes cookbook. And I was trying to make all of these recipes with these low and no calorie sweeteners. And I had to use minuscule amounts, like really minuscule amounts. And I had to be so careful, especially with some of the ones that didn't really absorb in the GI tract, because you know what happens. There's a little GI distress. And of course, I was testing everything. And I was like, oh, this is like really, it's good information, because I was like, oh, my stomach hurts after eating whatever. Okay, that was definitely too much, or this taste is off. And so that's kind of my experience with monk fruit.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned how much you're putting in. And that's a great point, because what I've seen, like for my mom, for example, she uses Splenda and she's like, oh, I'm going to use these, 4 packets of Splenda, because usually I use 4 packets of sugar. And I'm like, well, isn't this like way sweeter than regular sugar? So when people think about the conversions, generally, should they be using a lot less because it is a lot sweeter? And how much should they be consuming? Is there, a limit where if you go over that, you might get some GI distress or other unpleasant side effects?
Yeah. So this is where I say, you know yourself best, like 100%, because I believe it's 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight was the ADI for aspartame. So 40 grams per milligram of body weight is like the intake for aspartame. That means like you can actually consume quite a bit. However, I will say for people that have a sensitive gut, they can't even touch that upper limit. This is where you have to listen to you. Because as I said, when I was cooking with some of those ingredients, I found that even at like, a cup in a whole cake or something was giving me a reaction. And I don't consider myself to have a sensitive GI system. What I would say to folks who are looking to use those low and no calorie sweeteners regularly is to think about their taste buds, right? Just like you said, Wendy, if your mom is like putting like, I don't know how much she's using, but if she feels like, wow, it's so sweet, and then actual things that have table sugar don't add up, that's kind of like a retrain on your perception. And so I would say, like, tread lightly. Again, my bias is coming out because I'm not a lover of sweets. So I'm like, a teaspoon's fine. I have a teaspoon, but there's someone out there that might be like, you know what? I prefer to have a little bit more. But I think that this is also an opportunity for people, whatever they're purchasing, to actually read the nutrition facts panel. And I know that this is something that we say as clinicians all the time, and folks are like, you and your read the panel, I don't want to do it. But, because we're always out, read the nutrition facts panel. They're like, girl, I'm not doing that. However, there will be a serving size on it. And there's usually a little recommendation saying like, if you're using this in place of this, you don't need any more than X amount.
Yeah.
So follow the package instructions.
Yeah, super helpful.
Yeah, very helpful.
Well, this was a great conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and I'm sure our audience members did too. For people who want to learn more about you, find you online, follow you, and even work with you and your team members, where can they find you?
So I would say to folks, when they're not working with you all and your team members, they could come to us. You both know that I'm like, when we all win, we're all winning. So here we go. But for folks who are interested in learning more about me, they can follow me across social at Maya Feller RD. If they want to dive into the cookbook, Eating from Our Roots, they can get that cookbook everywhere that books are sold. And they could also head to my website if they want to work with one of the dietitians on the team. We are accepting new patients.
And then what about your podcast?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. If you want to, I know, y'all.
So many things.
So yeah, if you want to hear me weekly in your ear with my amazing co-host, Dr. Kavita Patel, we break down all sorts of things across wellness and we go hard. We dive in and we are having conversations with some of the folks that might be considered across the aisle because we want to know. And we're like, well, how does this work when we're thinking about accessibility and inclusivity? How does this work? So you could head over to anywhere that you listen to your podcast and you can find us on Well Now.
Okay. Can't wait.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you both for having me. I could talk to you forever. And I hope we get to do this again.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you're interested in nutrition counseling with one of our expert dietitians to help improve your prediabetes or diabetes, visit us at diabetesdigital.co.
Also, if you found our conversation helpful, do us a favor and rate and review this podcast on iTunes, plus share with someone who might find this helpful. You can also connect with us on Instagram at diabetesdigital.co. And tune in every Wednesday for practical, inclusive, and culturally humble diabetes insights. We'll catch you later. Bye.